There is a phenomenon in systems engineering where multiple subsystems fail simultaneously, not because of a single catastrophic event, but because the underlying architecture that held everything together suddenly shifts. It is called cascading failure. And when it happens in complex systems, most people only see the individual breakdowns. They miss the pattern. They don't realize they're witnessing the collapse of an entire structure. And right now, that is exactly what is happening in Washington, except nobody's calling it what it is. Within just a few weeks, 5 major events occurred, almost simultaneously. Hundreds of federal attorneys resigned from the Department of Justice. The Supreme Court handed down a redistricting decision that fundamentally reshapes congressional power. A suspect was arrested in the January 6th pipe bomb case after nearly 5 years of nothing. Federal agents launched one of the largest immigration enforcement operations in U.S. history, targeting a specific community in Minneapolis. And a Somali elected official in Maine was indicted on felony charges tied to gun theft and a condemned property linked to a massive drug operation. Now, if you heard about any one of these stories in isolation, you probably thought interesting, maybe troubling, but not earth-shattering. And that is exactly the problem, because these weren't isolated incidents. They were all symptoms of the same underlying shift, a structural transformation inside government institutions that most people completely missed. Here's what makes this so fascinating from a systems perspective. When you have multiple failures, or in this case multiple exposures happening at once, it is rarely coincidence. It is usually because the incentive structure changed, because the enforcement priorities shifted, because someone removed the protective barriers that were keeping certain behaviors hidden. And that is precisely what happened here. For years, decades really, there was an implicit understanding in Washington about what got investigated, what got prosecuted, what got exposed, and what got buried. Certain communities were off limits. Certain ideological positions were protected. Certain cold cases stayed cold, not because they were unsolvable, but because solving them wasn't a priority. And then an administration came in that changed the rules. They didn't just talk about draining the swamp, or reforming government, or holding people accountable. They actually did it. They changed the incentive structures. They reassigned personnel. They redefined missions. They told investigators to actually investigate and prosecutors to actually prosecute based on evidence rather than political considerations. And suddenly, all of these things that were always there, all of these problems that were always simmering beneath the surface, they all erupted at once. That is not chaos. That is what happens when you remove the mechanisms that were actively suppressing information. So today, I want to walk you through each of these events, explain what actually happened, show you how they connect, and reveal what this pattern tells us about the deeper transformation that is occurring right now in American government. Because by the end of this, you are going to see that this isn't about individual scandals or isolated failures. This is about a system that was built to serve itself, finally being forced to serve the people it was supposed to serve all along. And the people who built that system are absolutely panicking, because they know once this process starts, it is almost impossible to reverse. Let's start with the most revealing event of all, the mass resignation of over 200 attorneys from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Because this story tells you everything you need to know about how Washington actually works versus how it is supposed to work. Harmeet Dhillon gets appointed as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. She is in the job literally 2 weeks when she issues a memo. Simple, direct, no legal jargon, no bureaucratic hedging. The memo says from now on, the Civil Rights Division will protect the rights of all Americans, not just some, equal protection under the law. 14th Amendment, basic constitutional principle. The division will pivot away from exclusively focusing on racial and sexual minorities. It will dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. It will end the previous administration's transgender rights policies. It will address anti-Christian bias. Now you read that and you think, okay, that is literally what the Civil Rights Division is supposed to do. Enforce the Constitution neutrally, without regard to race, religion, sex, or political ideology. That is the job But here is what is absolutely stunning. Over 100 civil rights attorneys resigned immediately. Overnight. A third of the division's staff just walked out because they were told they had to treat everyone equally. Let that sink in for a moment. From a systems design perspective, you have an organization whose explicit constitutional mandate is equal protection. And when a new leader says we're going to actually do equal protection, a third of the workforce quits on the spot. That tells you the organization wasn't fulfilling its mandate. It was doing something else entirely. It was serving a specific ideological agenda, protecting certain groups, advancing certain policies, and treating the Constitution as an obstacle rather than a guide. And Dhillon's response is what makes this so interesting. She didn't beg them to stay. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften her position. She held the door open. She called it nature healing. She said the administrative state that adversely affected American politics was taking itself out. And she was right, because these weren't firings. This wasn't a purge. This was self-selection. People who fundamentally disagreed with the idea of neutral law enforcement chose to leave, rather than enforce the law neutrally. And more kept leaving. By a few weeks later, 70% of the division, over 200 attorneys total, had accepted resignation offers and left. 70%. That is not a personnel issue. That is not a morale problem. That is an organizational culture that was so ideologically captured that it couldn't function under constitutional principles. Now the media spun this as chaos, as evidence of incompetence, as authoritarian overreach. But that framing completely misses what actually happened here. What happened was accountability. For years, the Civil Rights Division had been weaponized to advance progressive social policies, rather than enforce the Constitution. Nobody could question it, because questioning it meant you were against civil rights. It was the perfect shield. And then someone came in who said, no, we're going back to the actual law, and the entire corrupt structure collapsed because it couldn't survive scrutiny. This is what I mean about cascading failure. Once you change the foundational rules, everything built on the old rules falls apart. And that is exactly what we're seeing across multiple institutions simultaneously. While the DOJ was imploding from within, something equally revealing was happening with the January 6th pipe bomb case. For nearly 5 years, the FBI told us they were investigating. They released grainy footage. They offered rewards. They claimed to be reviewing millions of data points. They arrested hundreds of people who were at the Capitol that day, many of whom did nothing more than walk around and take photos. But the person who actually planted live explosives at the RNC and DNC headquarters the night before, nowhere to be found, until the new administration took over. 10 months later, they made an arrest. Brian Cole, 30-year-old guy from Woodbridge, Virginia, just a few miles from 600, charged with transporting explosive devices and attempted malicious destruction. And here is the most stunning part. At the press conference, officials admitted there was no new evidence, no new tip, no surprise witness. The evidence was sitting there the whole time. What changed was the investigation itself. A new team came in, re-examined everything, actually did the work that the previous administration refused to do. Let me say that again. The evidence existed. The case was solvable. What was missing wasn't information. It was will. It was prioritization. It was leadership that actually wanted the case solved rather than keeping it open for political reasons. Think about what that reveals about institutional priorities. You had an administration that arrested grandmothers for trespassing, but couldn't find the person who planted actual bombs, because solving that case didn't serve their narrative. The moment priorities shifted, the case got solved. That is not law enforcement. That is selective prosecution based on political utility. And it is the same pattern we see with the Supreme Court redistricting decision. For years, lower courts blocked state legislatures from redrawing congressional maps, claiming racial gerrymandering, even when the maps were drawn for partisan advantage. The Supreme Court finally said, no, states have the right to draw maps based on politics, as long as race isn't the primary factor. It is a straightforward constitutional principle. States control their own electoral processes. But watch what happens now. Texas redraws maps that flip 5 Democratic seats to Republican. California faces its own redistricting lawsuit from the Trump Justice Department. If the logic gets applied consistently, we're looking at a nationwide reshuffling of political power, one that could lock in advantages for whichever party controls state legislatures. Critics call it voter suppression, an assault on democracy, but even Justice Kagan, in her dissent, acknowledged the plaintiffs didn't prove race was the motivating factor. They needed to show the partisan goals could have been achieved differently. They couldn't. So what we're really seeing is the end of one form of political manipulation being replaced by another. For decades, courts intervened in redistricting under the guise of protecting minority voting rights, which in practice meant protecting Democratic incumbents. Now the rules are shifting, and suddenly Republicans have the same tools Democrats used for years. The outrage isn't about principle. It is about power, and that is the pattern across all these events. Systems that were built to advantage one side are being restructured to either be neutral or advantage the other side. And the people who benefited from the old system are calling it authoritarianism, when really it is just accountability, finally being applied equally. Now let's talk about the Minneapolis operation and the main elected official story, because these reveal something even more uncomfortable that most people don't want to discuss. Over the past several years, federal prosecutors uncovered what they're calling one of the largest welfare fraud schemes in American history. Billions of dollars stolen from programs designed to help children and vulnerable populations. Child nutrition, housing assistance, autism services. And at the center of this network, concentrated in the Somali community in Minnesota. Now, before anyone accuses me of painting with too broad a brush, let me be very clear. Not all Somali immigrants are involved in fraud, obviously. But federal prosecutors stated plainly that Minnesota became a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity, and a significant portion involved members of the Somali diaspora, the largest such community in the United States. And here's where it gets darker. Some of that stolen money, funds that were supposed to feed hungry American kids, may have ended up funding Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-linked terror group in Somalia. American taxpayer dollars stolen through welfare fraud, potentially financing terrorism abroad. And the response for years: nothing. Programs continued. Warnings were ignored. Audits were delayed, until the new administration said enough and deployed over 100 federal agents to Minneapolis. Armored vehicles in the streets, targeted raids, dozens of arrests. One of the largest enforcement actions ever directed at a specific immigrant community in U.S. history. And simultaneously, in Lewiston, Maine, a Somali man named Iman Osman, who was elected to the city council, gets indicted on felony gun theft charges. But that is just the beginning. He was already under scrutiny for claiming to live at an address that turned out to be condemned, a property connected to a federal drug raid where agents seized over 20 pounds of meth, cocaine, fentanyl, and firearms. When the city clerk asked him to verify his address, his lawyer said he couldn't disclose it because of death threats. But when reporters checked with police, there was no record of any threats being reported. So you have an elected official with a fake address tied to a drug operation facing gun charges, and he was about to be sworn into public office. How did we get here? How does someone with this background not only get elected but remain in office as scandals pile up? The answer is a broader failure of accountability that spans multiple levels of government, and nowhere is that failure more visible than in Ilhan Omar's response. When CNN pressed her about the fraud scandal, she blamed program design, said programs were set up too quickly without guardrails. Nearly 60 people convicted of stealing over $1 billion, and her response is the programs were designed poorly. Not the people who committed the crimes, textbook deflection, and here is what makes this truly revealing. This isn't just an American problem. Norway, which has a significant Somali population, documented similar welfare fraud patterns. By early 2017, hundreds of cases under investigation disproportionately involving Somali immigrants. Reuters found that welfare and aid theft remains daily reality in Somalia itself, with camp owners, local officials, and aid workers all taking their cut. So when critics talk about importing third world problems, this is exactly what they mean. Cultural patterns around trust in institutions, rule of law, civic responsibility. They don't disappear because someone crosses a border. And when those patterns collide with generous welfare systems and inadequate oversight, the results are catastrophic. But we couldn't talk about this for years because talking about it meant you were racist. That is how broken the discourse became. Now let me connect all of this to the biggest story that almost nobody is covering adequately. While these individual events were making headlines, something much larger was happening in the background. A systematic restructuring of the federal government itself. The DOJ resignations are just one example. Across multiple agencies, the Trump administration has been using a combination of budgetary tools, personnel reclassifications, and mission redefinitions to fundamentally reshape how government operates. They call it dismantling the administrative state, and it is happening faster than almost anyone anticipated. Here is how it works from a systems engineering perspective. First, you have the Department of Government Efficiency, identifying entire programs, offices, and agencies for elimination or severe reduction. Department of Education, USAID, layers of middle management across dozens of departments. That is structure and budget attack from above. Simultaneously, individual agency heads like Dhillon are attacking personnel and mission from inside. They're redefining what their divisions do, who they serve, what priorities they pursue. And as we saw with those 200 attorneys, this creates an environment where ideologically entrenched bureaucrats essentially fire themselves. Then you add Schedule F, which the administration reinstated on day one. This reclassifies tens of thousands of civil service roles as policy-making positions, stripping them of normal protections and allowing political terminations. And finally, there is budgetary impoundment. The president withholds or delays spending that Congress appropriated. There are legal limits, but the executive has tremendous discretion over how and when funds get distributed. What the administration has been doing is silent impoundment, directing agencies to withhold funds without formally notifying Congress, making it much harder to legally challenge. Put it all together, and you have a coordinated pincer movement, structure and budget from above, personnel, and mission from below. The result: the administration has already shed nearly 320,000 federal jobs, one of the largest mass layoffs in Washington history. And the long-term goal is targeting up to 75% of the federal workforce over the next 3 years. Now, to some people that sounds extreme, dangerous even, but to others, particularly those who watch the federal bureaucracy grow more powerful, unaccountable, and ideologically driven over decades, it sounds like exactly what is needed. Because here is the uncomfortable truth Washington doesn't want to admit. Much of the federal government isn't serving the people anymore. It is serving itself. Bureaucrats protecting bureaucrats. Agencies justifying their own existence. Regulations creating more regulations. And anyone who threatens that system, anyone who asks why do we need this, or who does this actually help, gets treated as an enemy. That is not governance. That is institutional self-preservation. And what we're witnessing right now is the first serious attempt in generations to break that cycle. So why is all of this happening at once? Why now? Because for the first time in a very long time, there is an administration willing to actually use power. Not just talk about reform, not just propose changes and hope Congress goes along, but to systematically, methodically dismantle the structures that made real change impossible. Individually, each story seems disconnected. Mass resignations, that is personnel. Supreme Court ruling, that is elections. Cold case arrest, that is law enforcement. Fraud investigations, that is oversight. Restructuring agencies, that is efficiency. But step back and look at the whole picture. You see a government in the middle of its most significant ideological and operational transition in decades. You see institutions captured by one political worldview being forced to reckon with a different one. You see accountability returning to places where it has been absent for years. And you see the people who built and benefited from the old system absolutely panicking, because they know once this process starts, it is very hard to reverse. Once the public sees the emperor has no clothes, that the experts don't have all the answers, that the bureaucracy isn't indispensable, everything changes. And that is what they didn't want exposed. Not the individual scandals, not specific failures, but the larger truth that the system they built was never about serving you. It was about serving them. And the moment someone came along willing to challenge that, to actually drain the swamp rather than just talk about it, the whole facade started to crumble. So what does this mean for you, for your family, for the country? It means we're living through genuine transformation, not campaign promises forgotten after inauguration, but real structural change that will shape American government and society for generations. The stories you are hearing that seem confusing or contradictory are symptoms of this larger transformation. And the more you understand the bigger picture, the less surprising any individual story becomes. The narrative you've been fed for years, that government knows best, that experts should be trusted, that change is dangerous, is being challenged in real time. And the people who built careers on that narrative are fighting back with everything they have. But here's the thing about truth. Once it is out, it is very hard to put back in the box. What we're witnessing is the slow, sometimes messy, but ultimately unstoppable process of truth coming to light. So stay informed. Ask questions. Think critically. Don't let anyone tell you what you are seeing isn't real or important. Because it is, and you are part of the generation that lived through some of the most significant changes in American history. This isn't the end. It is just the beginning. The next chapters will be written by the choices we make right now about accountability, justice, and what kind of country we want to leave to our children and grandchildren.